I'm not going to go into a deep introduction about myself and who I am, but just to let you know, I've recently conducted my PhD research in history around the deaf community in Ireland. So it's focused on the 19th century to the early 20th century. I primarily focused on a variety of institutions, such as prisons, courts, workhouses, and that's what I will speak of tonight, and deaf schools. And you may wonder why those are linked. Because of the poor law, there is a correlation there, and I will speak about that tonight. And my presentation will be specifically around Belfast, workhouse, and schools. So I haven't had a chance to do that in person in Belfast, which I would have liked to be able to present this research, but unfortunately we had to move online, but that's fine. So we can move on to the next slide now. Okay, in relation to Belfast and the deaf community and the deaf population, you can see here the figures from the 19th century, and the numbers of the deaf population grew exponentially. If you compare the Dublin population, which is the first line, and Belfast, which is the second line underneath, you can see Belfast started off with quite a small number compared to Dublin, and then over time overtook the Dublin numbers. So by 1911, Belfast's deaf population was actually biggest in Ireland. So you may think that throughout the years that Dublin was always the highest deaf population, but that actually, in fact, is not the case. At that time, Belfast as a city itself was growing because of new industry and new factories being established and inviting workers and attracting workers because there was plenty of employment options. And as a result, it grew as a city. And at the time, Dublin was a bit stagnant in that regard. But we can see it had the same effect there in terms of the deaf community. And over the years, and now I would have gleaned this information from the Irish census, we see there's two gaps there, 1881 and 1891, because the report didn't mention the exact numbers in Belfast. The 1901 had that data, and so did the 1911 census, but there was a gap there in the other years. For the 1911 census, it mentioned that there was 262 deaf people in Belfast. However, different reports offer a different number, and the reason for that is that the census, same as it would be now, it's conducted every 5 years, where everyone has a manual form and every home has to fill in who lives in the home and the information such as their name, their age, their job, etc. And that would have been the same in the past, but it would have happened every 10 years. And at that time, when filling out that form, if it mentioned that a person was deaf, they would have used different terms like deaf and dumb, which I know is no longer used, but that would have been the only descriptor and sent off. Then a second person would come to question for more in-depth information around the specifics of that person, how they became deaf, what the family history is. So you got far more information from the 1911 the 1911 census. It mentioned there was 3 to 5 deaf people. So the numbers differ slightly. So you can see from this slide, it had the age brackets, it had how many children, how many younger people, how many middle-aged people were deaf. So all that information is available. And also just to let you know, I'm happy to share those slides if you're interested and you'd like a copy. I'm more than willing to share them with you after. I'm sure many of you watching will know where this photo is located. It's the Mission Hall for Adult Deaf and Dumb. And it would have been given the name FP because it used to be in Fishwick Place and then moved to College Square, but it still retained the acronym FP and was known as such. So it remained vacant and dormant for years, and then they constructed new apartments. So it was sold on recently, I believe. Maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what happened to that building. And that became the centre of the Belfast deaf community. I'm sure many of you know it well. And you may feel like I'm reiterating something that may be common knowledge, but I was surprised at how many various activities were offered in the mission hall, such as you can see, the variety of organizations and clubs on offer that met there. So it would have been a very busy time and a very active deaf community. So I've picked a few photographs to give you an idea of how busy and how diverse the centre was and the deaf community was at that time. The newspaper at that time in Belfast would often cite articles and write on the many activities being held in the Belfast deaf community. There was interest in sign language, in the dramas being offered, the deaf mute brigade, which would have been like the Scouts at that time. Deaf people would congregate for outings and trips. So you can see it was a very vibrant, active community. And there would be diversity within that. There'd be some people who were well off, some those who were less well off and poorer. So there was variety there as well. And we're going to explore some of that today. Just to take a step back and to explain about the poor law. At the moment, it doesn't exist. It was scrapped many years ago and it was replaced with, within Northern Ireland, it's the NHS. In the south of Ireland, it would be the health board system. But in the past, those services didn't exist. There was no social welfare, no labour. Any poor people, if they required any help, they could beg as an option. But in the early 19th century, Ireland had many thousands of people who were extremely destitute and earned very little. And if they were able to gain work, they may only be on very short-term contracts on a very short-term basis. And it became a growing problem. So the British government recognized this and decided that they had to establish a poor law system. They already had their own poor law system in place, and they decided to implement a similar system in Ireland. And that started in 1838, where it was the Irish poor law system. Once the law was enacted, Ireland as a whole was broken down into 130 poor law unions across the island. Each individual union was administered by a board of guardians. And each union had its own individual workhouse, which meant the island of Ireland had 130 workhouses. Later on, it was they realized that they may need additional workhouses for those that became overcrowded and needed more space. And then in the end, we had 163. And then in 1847, the law was amended so that rather than having to be admitted to a workhouse, people could be offered outside assistance so they could remain at home and get social welfare support, such as food or some subsistence to remain at home. Across the north of Ireland, there were many poor law unions, but they wouldn't be demarcated in the same way as counties. There were various different borders, and I'm going to show you now what Northern Ireland would have looked like and the breakdown of the unions across the north. And remember, there's one workhouse in each of these areas. So you can see there from that picture.
So tonight I will focus on the workhouses in Belfast. Belfast did have workhouses, but maybe you didn't know where. So they're actually not in fact gone. They did become the hospital. Some buildings, some old buildings, were demolished and replaced, and this workhouse became the hospital. So I will show you a map of that time, as I'm sure some of you will know where it is located. So it is located on the Lisburn Road. I'm sure many of you know the workhouse. There is another institution, a well-known institution next door. So it's the deaf school. So before it was the deaf school, but now the building is demolished and it's moved to Jordanstown. But the two institutes that were close to each other did have quite a big connection, and I will explain that a bit more later. So the Belfast Workhouse opened in 1841. The workhouse itself opened, but there was a number of small buildings surrounding it, and that included a hospital, the fever hospital, a school for poor children. There was a number of different buildings surrounding the workhouse. And it did have the ability in 1901, around 3,359 people were people or inmates, as they would have been called, were able to fit in that workhouse and be facilitated by it. And that happened in 1901. And after the Second World War, the workhouse was no longer in use as a workhouse, but it did change its use into a hospital. So just to explain briefly about this, Belfast workhouses were not the same. There was some very large ones, and often the workhouses in Ireland look like this image here. So you can see the three sections, the three quarters. The front was for poor people who could enter the building for the first time. They were questioned and interviewed and admitted into the workhouse itself. And this middle building was separate, where they would be admitted. Men and women were segregated, children were segregated. Men and women could go outside into the yard, but that was also segregated. They were not allowed to communicate with each other. They were to remain separate. And then the back building, it had a small hospital. It had a number of different wards for people who had intellectual disabilities, mental health issues. And if somebody died, there was a building to locate them. And that was called the dead house. So there was a number of different buildings. And that structure was quite similar for all the workhouses in Ireland. So I'll briefly show you an example. Belfast Workhouse, the three buildings that were there, are no longer there, but in Lisburn, The hospital now that's located there, that was a workhouse. And I'll show you an image of that. If you see this structure here, the two buildings at the end of this long structure on either side, if you compare it to the plan on the previous slide, you're able to identify the features, the double roofs at either end. So just the workhouse in Belfast, the main building was demolished, but some of the smaller surrounding buildings still remain there now. And for example, maybe you have seen previously the city hospital. You probably haven't really looked at it in depth, but in part of that was the workhouse. And it's same with Ireland now. There is a lot of buildings that remain uh, in structure, but their use has changed. They've become hospitals or they have been converted to private use. So just to go back briefly and mention about the poor law again, and how that really did link with the deaf community. They're the Board of Guardians that I previously mentioned. You might wonder exactly who they were, but this here is an image of them. And this would be from Waterford in Dungarvan, the Board of Guardians from that area. So you can see the rows of men. Around 1890, that picture was taken. And I'm sure you're looking at this picture and you can see that they are all men. Maybe you've noticed that. But later on, some women did actually join the Board of Guardians as well. But at that time, that area, the Board of Guardians were all men. And they were well off local men, business owners, doctors, or a variety of other upper class men. And just to explain briefly about deaf education, I'm sure you know the deaf schools in Ireland, there is a number of them. But children did not have free entry to these schools. They did have to pay a fee. Now, the deaf schools did depend on charity or charitable donations. So if you compare this to hearing children, from 1831 onwards, the national school system was established, and that meant that a number of different schools were built, and the government financed these and paid teachers and employed teachers for hearing children to be able to attend school and gain a primary education free of charge. So the national school system did spread throughout Ireland, and it was a brilliant system for hearing children. But deaf children were excluded from this because the deaf schools were not recognised as national schools. And at the same time, the deaf schools did campaign for, or they did not campaign for recognition because deaf education was a little bit different. They wanted to be more independent. They didn't want to follow the exact curriculum that was established for the other schools. So they did depend on charitable donations and other forms of monetary intake. So throughout the years, free education was great, and a lot of children did avail of it, but deaf children still did not have access. If their families could afford to send them to the deaf school, that was lucky. They could get charitable donations, but it really did vary a lot on the child's circumstances. And there was no entitlement for a deaf child to be sent to a deaf school. In 1843, the new law was passed and there was an amendment to the Poor Law made. And that meant the Board of Guardians could make the decision to approve a fund for the deaf schools. And it would mean if they decided that a family was poor enough, if they really required this finance, they would provide it to the family to send their deaf child to the school. But the Board of Guardians didn't have to provide this fund. They didn't have to pay. They could. They could decide also that the family didn't require it. So that was a problem there. So the research that I did found that the variety of Board of Guardians around Ireland did or were willing to provide funding, but there was some that didn't wish to provide that funding. So it did vary a lot. The Belfast Board of Guardians, we'll see if what kind of attitude they had. This is one example by 1880. The Belfast Board of Guardians did provide finance to a total of 21 deaf and blind children. So you can see this sample here, or this example here, and this was in the weekly newspaper that was published, and it published the figures. So the information from Cabra's report shows that Belfast were willing to provide funding to send children to Dublin also. Of course, there was funding provided for children to go to the Belfast school, but there was difficulties in accessing that. And there was, the information, or I don't, sorry, have information on the Belfast school, but in the Cabra school, there is a number of information there that I was able to gather. And you can see here, through the years, that information is there about the number of children that the Belfast Board of Guardians provided funding to, and it gets gradually bigger, so that by 1912, overall, there was 50 deaf children who were sent to Dublin. And it looked like the Belfast Board of Guardians were very positive in their willingness to provide funding for deaf children. So if you compare the Belfast Union and the surrounding areas, that's very different. From the Belfast Deaf School report, it says the other unions of Ulster were very strict and very hard to get support from for deaf children and for their education, and that attempts were made, but they were ignored or not acknowledged. This report states that any time the Belfast Board was requested for help or funding, they were provided with it in Belfast.
So quickly, also, I'm going to speak around the Irish workhouse. You may have heard of this information before, but you may not fully have fully understood what a workhouse was. So from the picture here, obviously it's very stark in terms of the crowding and the numbers of people trying to access these poor, dirty conditions. They're hungry people, they haven't had access to food, and they are trying to gain entry to this workhouse. And it has happened like during famine times, where these workhouses became very overcrowded or the only option because they had no other options in terms of getting food. So it became a very full, disease-ridden place. However, the workhouses weren't always this way over the years. During famine times, obviously, was the worst. At the time, people didn't want to enter the workhouses. There was a stigma attached. and they would do anything they could to avoid having to go into the workhouse. And that was the same attitude people had for years. And it also wasn't somewhere people were sent or forced to go, or a court ordered mandate where they were sentenced to time of the workhouse. People themselves had to decide that they were going to enter the workhouse. And it wasn't easy to go in because the Board of Guardians would meet you at the admissions hall and question your income, the assets you have, the land you have, your family background, any employment you have. So they would do an interrogation into your finances and the kind of situation you're in. And sometimes they would turn people away. If you were approved entry, then you would be admitted in. And upon entering, if you wanted to leave again, that was possible. But you must give 3 hours notice to leave the workhouse. So you would tell them in advance that you planned to leave, because you would have to return your workhouse clothes and get your own personal belongings back before you could exit the workhouse. If you just decided yourself to go without telling anyone and tried to maybe hop a wall, the police would actually arrest you on account of stealing workhouse clothes. And it was an awful place to have to reside. Terrible conditions where families who were so destitute and had no options in terms of food would enter the workhouse, and both parents would be separated and the children would be separated again. So there was no option to communicate or meet up with your family members. So it was awful. They also had very strict rules in terms of conduct that you had to adhere to. If you broke a rule, you may be thrown out or punished, sent to the punishment room, and you may have to stay there for 1 day. The food was very poor quality, and because it's called a workhouse, there is obviously a work element to it. You're given tasks to do, like rock breaking or sewing, cleaning, or various other duties. So it wasn't an easy life. It wasn't just heading into the workhouse to be looked after. You had to do a lot of hard work to stay there. I had mentioned briefly there about famine times, and there was severe overcrowding and tight conditions in the workhouse at that time, and the workhouse couldn't cope. And that was the same in Northern Ireland. The famine did affect Northern Ireland and Ulster. In 1847, a decision was made that rather than having everyone come to the workhouse for support, that people could get outdoor relief, which would be funding in order to stay at home and be able to survive outside of the workhouse. And they would get some subsistence in that regard. And that included deaf people. You can see the definition here of those who were eligible to access that. So those who are permanently disabled, mental defects, and some deaf people would qualify in that, and they would themselves maybe suggest, yeah, I am under that category, so I can get this outdoor relief. And many people did get that outdoor relief. From 1851 onwards, we saw that reduce, and the workhouse did change. And the number of people entering the workhouse declined then because of the end of the famine. And those who decided to enter the workhouse, maybe the elderly, those who are physically disabled, people with intellectual disabilities, people who are homeless. And they were the categories of people who would enter the workhouse post-famine. The poor law system continued for many years, right up to 1920 or 1921-22, when Ireland became independent. And from there, they immediately made the decision to close all workhouses and drop that system. In England and Wales, that system continued until 1929. In Northern Ireland, it continued well beyond that and finished in the early 1940s. So Northern Ireland retained that system the longest. I'll show you here some photographs of England and Wales. Ireland's system looked slightly different and the workhouse looked slightly different, but you can imagine from looking at this photo the stark conditions people resided in. This is a workhouse in London in this picture. again from London. Now I have some photos from Ireland, and it would have been from the late 1890s. So where photos were available. So this picture here is the infirmary, which is like a small scale hospital, but very tight on space, and it would have been very poor conditions. One advantage was that it was free to access, because at that time, hospitals were private and they would have been quite expensive. But if you were poor, you could enter the hospital or the infirmary for free. Now, the medical care would have been a bit subpar, but it was something. And many people did use that service. I had mentioned about the ward that was available for those with mental health problems or intellectual disabilities. And often they would have called it the idiot ward or the lunatic ward, which is awful terminology to put on it, but that was the language they used at the time. And this is an example of those who would have lived there in this picture here. This is from Cavan. It's Coot Hill in Cavan. And potentially one of them are deaf, but I couldn't say that. In terms of Northern Ireland, I have found a photograph from Lurgan Workhouse. This is in the dining hall, and the sign above on the wall, God is good. So people eating their dinner, reflecting on God and the discipline of the workhouse at the time, the rules that must be obeyed. So, like I say, it was very strict. So the next picture is of Belfast Workhouse. And this is from 1905. And you see elderly inmates here having their cup of tea outside. Again, maybe one of them was potentially deaf, but I don't know. The next one is a photo of what you can imagine inside the workhouse would have been like in Belfast Workhouse. So this is Christmas in the workhouse. So children would have their own ward. And maybe just in the back of that photo there, you can see some kind of Christmas-like person in the background there. So Santa's there. So maybe, the children had a happy occasion of seeing Santa. But to be honest, for myself, when I see that, I imagine as a small child seeing that feature in front of me, it would have been awfully frightening. In terms of the number of deaf people entering the workhouse, there were actually many. But the number itself may look small, but the percentage reflection of the deaf community compared to the hearing community is very high. So the deaf number would be very high compared to the hearing people in the workhouse as being lower. So you'll see here the statistics of the time. And you can see that across the years, that there was always that huge disparity between hearing and deaf. And the percentage of the hearing population was far lower than the percentage of the deaf population entering the workhouse. And if someone were to enter the workhouse, I want to go through the kinds of information that was documented on them. So I have done significant research around the Belfast workhouse, but I haven't managed to go through all the record registry books. I have picked a selection of them and had a chance to research them individually, but I haven't had a chance to do them all. But I'll give you an example of what the register would have looked like and the kind of information that was documented on an inmate. So this is the name of inmates, and one here who is deaf and the kind of detail described. You can see the name. It may look a little bit out of focus there. It was Margaret Breslin. So F for female. She was an orphan, so no parents. Labourer, so that was the class of, so excuse me, she was from a labouring class. So she would have been poor, or C, meaning Roman Catholic, Catholic, deaf and dumb. And she entered on the 7th of February, 1896. And if you see the handwritten note, it says she was sent back from Cabra. So that means she would have previously attended Cabra and was sent back. So there's no information on whether she had completed her education or not. A second note mentions that she had entered in 1886 and left in 1906. And then she was moved to an asylum. So 10 years she stayed in the workhouse until she was transferred to an asylum. You may ask yourself why deaf people felt that they had to enter the workhouse. Because deaf people at the time would have been very similar to hearing people in that they may enter the workhouse for a single period of time or had planned to, and then end up staying there and potentially dying there. Other deaf people may have utilized the workhouse differently. They go for a very short stint and leave again, but then it becomes a recurring thing where they're in and out on several occasions. But that's the same pattern that hearing inmates would follow, that they may enter and leave the workhouse many times over the course of their lives. And deaf people may have to enter the workhouse because they've been homeless. And I have found some examples of deaf people who were mentioned as no fixed residence, so technically homeless. And they may enter the workhouse for a short time, potentially 1 week, and then they've heard of work opportunities, so they leave to sort out work. And then if that didn't work out, if they got dismissed or that work came to an end, they'd return to the workhouse again. Also at that time, there were no long-term permanent jobs. You may get a short-term job, and then when that comes to an end, you're left at a loss as to what to do next. Whereas, in the workhouse, you have regular meals, you have guaranteed bed and board. And again, there may be employers who have prejudice or a poor attitude towards having a deaf employee, and they're not able to avail of work and end up in the workhouse again because it's a safety net for deaf inmates. If someone needed medical care, if they were injured, they may enter the workhouse if they're sick because they know there's a free access hospital. Rather than pay for a private hospital, they'd be willing to go through the workhouse system to avail of that care. So I've noticed that there are examples of deaf people who have entered the workhouse only because they were sick, not because they were poor or destitute, because they wanted to access that health care. And oftentimes, deaf people would have ended up in that lunatic ward, where upon assessment at the admissions department in the workhouse, they were deemed eligible for the lunatic ward and then remained there.
The interpreters are just swapping over the headset there. So this picture here, I absolutely love this picture. And I think I know who is in this. So it's from a newspaper, a homeless deaf person who traveled around Ireland. And this kind of person was often a character that you would find in the workhouse, somebody who didn't have anywhere to stay or wasn't sure where they would stay for the night. They would enter the workhouse. But this looks like some kind of bed that they're carrying. And it would be a mobile bed that they could bring around with them. They could fold out and put a mat on the ground, as you can see there. So I took 1 year, 1888, just as a sample, so we can see what happened there with regards to deaf people entering the Belfast workhouse. And this is from the records. It did include deaf and dumb, deaf and mute, and deaf. The word deaf that you'll see really at that time we wouldn't have the same understanding as we would have these days. Deaf back then meant that it would be somebody who had, lost their hearing. Um, you would have mute people, somebody who maybe can hear but can't speak. So you'll see a variety of terminologies here used against the names. And you can see this list here. There's a variety of different ages. There's some older people, 60 years old, some younger people, 8 years old, 10 years old. There's occupations. Sometimes people had a job. I think labor is there. Baker is there. A sailor. You can see the variety of different occupations, and that's in the course of 1 year in this workhouse. And you can see when you compare them, some people just stayed for a short amount of time. Some entered the workhouse and stayed for a very long period of time. There is one woman, Anne Montague. She entered the workhouse and stayed for 413 days. So you see there is a variety of people who did enter the workhouse. So I will just explain briefly about two different examples of people who went into the workhouse. And there was one person who went in and out quite frequently, and another person who stayed long term. Now, this one person, the first I'll speak about, is Susan Sparks. She did enter and leave the workhouse very frequently. So before she did attend the Belfast Deaf School, her name does appear on the records here to say she did attend in 1858 and gained her education there, but I don't know if she finished school or left school early. But later on, she was poor, she needed support, she needed accommodation, and she did enter the Belfast workhouse. But she didn't enter it and stay for a long period of time. She left frequently and returned. So you see the name appears a number of times and it is the same person, but it is only the course over the course of 2 years from 1890 to 1892. And you can see how often her name appears there. But you might notice that the age is quite different on the occurrences on the list. And her religion. You'll see CI, that means Church of Ireland. You'll see Presbyterian. You see that it's recorded differently a number of times. And you might think that means it's different people, but I feel it's the same person for a number of reasons. First, firstly, her name is unusual. Secondly, it does record her as being deaf. And I feel that, of course, it was a hearing person who questioned her and recorded this information. So, of course, they probably didn't know sign. So there was a miscommunication. They didn't understand what she was saying, or maybe Susan didn't understand what they were saying. Maybe the level of English was quite high on these written forms and she didn't understand. Maybe they just popped down what they thought the answers to the questions that they thought. So I believe it's the same person. And you can see every time that she did enter the workhouse, it was very short, 5 days, 6 days, it was a very short period of time. So the next person I'll talk about is a different example. So this deaf man here, his name is James Lyons, and he entered the Belfast deaf school in 1865. And later on, in 1891, he entered the Belfast workhouse. And in the registry book, it mentions that he has a weak mind. And I believe that that may have come from the hearing person's perspective on James here. Maybe they viewed him as being a slow learner. Maybe he did have a mild intellectual disability, but he attended school, so he proceeded through that. And James was in school in 1865. That report there is 1872. It means that he spent 7 years in the education system. So I don't believe that he has a weak mind. I believe that that was the perspective of the hearing person who had evaluated him during his attendance in the workhouse, and they put down of weak mind. But James entered the workhouse and he stayed for a very long period of time. The census of 1901 and 1911 both record his presence in the Belfast workhouse. So we'll just have a look at the 1901 document here. This line has a shortened name, JL. So it didn't include his full name. Obviously, the information was sensitive. But one interesting comment, it says the workhouse, but it does mention that he was in the lunatic ward for intellectual disabilities. So it does look like James was moved to that ward. And further across the line, it does explain the reason as to why.
It mentions that he has dementia, but I wouldn't believe it with the same understanding of what dementia means currently. And at the time, they just meant of someone of lower capacity. And for that 10-year time period, from 1891, since he entered, to 1901, over the course of 10 years, and it recorded that. But then from the 1911 census, which was the second census he was present for, the description around the kind of disability there says that he was an imbecile, which is an awful term to use because, again, it means someone of reduced capacity in their mind. And we have no way to verify if that information is even true because that's just one person's potential analysis, but having no understanding of a deaf person, that assessment could be totally false. But he remained in the workhouse for many years of his life. Like I say, he was there present for the 1911 census and beyond. In Northern Ireland workhouses, they continued until the 1940s. And you can see an example here. James himself remained in that workhouse until 1932, and he died there. So in total, he was in the workhouse for 41 years of his life. He died age 75. And interestingly, beside the age column, under the employment, it mentioned he was a dealer. So that would have been that he was involved in selling things, a merchant of sorts. But then it was recorded that he was of weak mind. But he managed his way through school, worked as a dealer, and he was assessed as having a weak mind. So I feel it was just a hearing person's perspective and it was just recorded without any further investigation or verification. The final story that I'm going to go through with you today is from 1904. That time, there was more and more deaf people who would have attended school, gained an education, used sign language, were able to read and write and interact. And there is examples of deaf people who never were able to avail of those opportunities. And there's one example here from 1904 where the deaf woman had entered the workhouse to stay for one night. And she was in her 60s, so she would have been old at that time, and a deaf woman herself. And she stayed for one night. The following day, they said, you can go home. But they noticed that she was wandering, and the staff realized she didn't know where she was going. So they contacted Francis McGinn from the mission hall, a deaf gentleman, who arranged to meet this woman. And he did try and communicate with her via sign language and ask her some questions to gain some information about who she is and where she was from, what was her work, and found it very hard to communicate with her because she never attended a school. And she would have worked as a weaver previously, but the boss treated her very cruelly, so she decided to leave. And he asked her, what is her name? And she couldn't understand that concept of what a name is, what a name meant, and couldn't understand that concept. They asked, where are you from? Again, couldn't understand. So Francis McGinn was shocked by this and wrote a letter, a very detailed letter to the local newspaper outlining her situation and that there needed to be some kind of institution or home for older deaf people like her who don't have a job and had somewhere to go. And you can see here the letter that Francis McGinn wrote. It mentions that England did have a home for those who are old and weak, infirm, or feeble. And they need to have something in Ireland because that didn't exist. Belfast didn't have that facility and it needed to be established. So I'm going to finish up now soon, but I did want to just say to you all that my research on the Belfast workhouse, I have completed some of the work available, but there's still much to do. So I'm not finished that research, but this is where I have got a lot of the information from. I'll give you a look here at how to get some information. So as I've mentioned, Ireland had several workhouses across the country, but in some unions, the paperwork is now gone, the details and the registers are no longer available because they were damaged or lost. Dublin has some, Cork has some records, and there are examples of where we would get that information across the Republic. But now Northern Ireland has still a very rich history of those records being kept. So there's plenty of records there and available for research, and they're held here in Prony. And this is where you would see where the information is available. So I've started with little snippets of research on various of these union areas, and I might just look for specific examples of deaf people. It is a lot of work, but I would definitely encourage you if you're interested, go to Prony yourself and have a look through this. It's free to order the materials. You become a member, it's free to join. You order materials, and then yourself you can peruse these documents and find examples of deaf or blind or various other people who would have availed of the workhouse. So that information is there to be gone through. So please, I would encourage you to do your research if you're interested in history. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm finished up now, so thank you.